two, one. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we start our Friday show with a grain market update from K-State grain economist Dan O'Brien and the senior economist at the IGP Institute at K-State, Guy Allen. Dan, Guy, thank you both so much for taking the time to join us today.
Thank you, Shelby.
As we're talking through our different commodities today for the grain market, looking domestically and internationally, starting off with corn and Dan, domestically, what are we seeing?
Well, coming out of Monday's USDA WASDE report, Monday the 12th, the balance sheet for U.S. corn uh, didn't have had I guess minor adjustments, but the adjustment that was made was important. The old crop ending stocks figure dropped or was lowered to 1.415 billion bushels, or uh, yeah, 1.4 billion bushels and change. And that was on the strength of the USDA increasing the export number by 50 million bushels. So basically, exports 50 million bushels higher, ending stocks 50 million bushels lower. And I think what's significant about that, when you start looking at historically, when we've ended up with ending stocks that have gotten to 1.4 below 1.2, 1.3, et cetera, then you're starting those are times the last several years where we've seen higher prices. So the ending stocks from last year, and that's the estimate for what we'll have on August the 31st of this year, then become the September 1 beginning stocks for the next marketing year. And there were no major changes in the supply demand balance sheet. The USDA took the prospective plantings acreage of 95.3 million acres planted as the farmer survey estimate, 87.3 harvested times 181 bushels an acre, and came up with an estimate of 15.82 billion bushels. So by far a record high corn crop. And the surprise, though, to me anyway, is that with that higher production, you're thinking, well, gracious, so we're going to end up with 2 to 2.5 billion bushels of carryout. But instead, what the USDA had done from their earlier uh, points of view, or earlier being at that USDA Outlook conference or forum that they had in February, they sharply raised their feed use up to 5.9 million a billion bushels. And this year we had 5.75. So they're looking at strong feed use because of cheap grain and ethanol unchanged. Exports, if we just raised this year's exports, the one we're in, to 2.6 billion, they're projecting next year's at 2.675. So they're anticipating large feeding, large exports, steady ethanol, and ending up and projecting ending stocks at 1.8 billion bushels. And like I say, my expectation with that bigger crop is, gracious, we're heading for 2.5 billion. So with that, then the stocks to use figure is at 11.6% stocks to use, and 11.64 to be exact. And then the projected price projected pretty low, down at 420. So 435 this marketing year, 420 the next. Not a lot of change. And so I in looking at what happens with that projection. So, Guy, I'll take this shot and invite your comment. I think it. I think that 181 bushels an acre is a record high. We've got some dry conditions projected for June, July, August. Chip Redmond, others have talked about that AccuWeather, about the anticipation of some challenges over after the next week or so. But then, so I if we so I put about a 30% chance that will actually get that record number. We haven't been within a bushel plus of it yet. So, and we've got more acres spreading the average yield out. So if you look at where we end up with ending stocks to use, and prices, we start shaving at 181 down to say 179, 177, 175. Then you're looking at 1.6 billion bushel carry out to 1.5 to 1.4, your rationing usage. Prices get to four, instead of 420, more like 460, $5, 5.60. So really, I guess it's in the weatherman's hands again in terms of the domestic U.S. situation. Guy, what are your thoughts on the international side?
Well, I think you're right. The market's really not showing us any weather premium in these current prices at all. But just to point out the market structure, we are looking at a 20-cent little better inverse on the July versus September contract. So there's a pretty good incentive there to get that old crop corn sold. I don't think growers particularly are going to make the same mistake they did last year in carrying too much grain over. And even the July Dees at a 10 cent inverse. So for even if you're a hedger, you're going to have most of that program shipped by the end of July. That said, just in the wake of that, we have seen the basis for corn particularly kick up in the last couple of weeks, even following the USDA report, which we haven't seen the flat price movement upwards that I sort of would have expected, but we have seen some strong reaction in basis, particularly from domestic end users, and that's starting to flow over into the export market there a bit as well. Just note we are coming out a bit of a high water situation at New Orleans with a bunch of water coming down the Ohio a couple of weeks ago. They did restrict traffic a bit and loading, but that corn export programs remain quite strong. Just coming to your comment on world stocks to use situation. Look, we're getting very, very tight when you look at the major exporters, and this is always a concern that we talk about. If we look 3 years ago, ending stocks to use on major exporters was about 11%. Last year, or this current marketing year, by the end of August, we expect to get that down to 4.6. And if you look at USDA numbers for the coming marketing year, 25, 26, that's 3.6%. Those are very, very tight numbers. And, we're really not seeing any rationing of demand in there at all. Just to look at that export trade complex a bit, I'll start commenting on China. China corn imports are estimated by USDA at 10 million metric tons. The last couple of months, that's unchanged. I thought that's maybe a bit high, but we're experiencing some dry weather in China. Keep in mind, China is the second largest corn producer in the world. So maybe I'm a bit more optimistic that we'll achieve that 10 million metric tons. It's also good to see we seem to have a bit of a breakthrough in the trade negotiations with China last week. And I'm optimistic in the next few weeks, we're going to see a number of these trade deals come to the table. And we'll see how China fits in there. I'm actually in China the week after next, and I'll get to have some conversations with some traders on the ground. Just looking at some other major exporters there. Argentina's production is coming in at about 53 million metric tons. Brazil, 131. That's up a million metric tons from last year. Russia's up a million metric tons, coming in at 16. South Africa, they've been experiencing dry weather down there as we've been talking. Their harvest is coming in at the moment, 16 and a half. Ukraine is up significantly at 30 and a half million metric tons. That's up 3.7 million metric tons. So yeah, it's sort of interesting to look at that production scenario. So I think everybody's feeling pretty comfortable at the moment, but look, I'm quite optimistic we're going to see these prices continue to move higher in corn.
And moving on to crop.
It's mainly a weather risk situation.
Yes.
Risk, and even those numbers that we talked about for the next marketing year, those are still on the come. They're estimated out there. So a lot of risk and uncertainty to be dealt with.
And moving on to crop, we've heard quite a bit about this week, wheat. And what are we seeing domestically for wheat?
If I could have one last comment on grain sorghum, USDA came up with their balance sheet for grain sorghum, and whereas this year exports have fallen off sharply, they must be planning on the U.S. and China reconciling in terms of these trade disagreements. So they came back in, Guy, and projected 250 million bushels of exports again. This year we're probably gonna have trouble making 100. So anyway, there you go. And any comments on that, just real quick?
Just on the sorghum, look, they left exports unchanged. We saw Argentina and Australia have reasonable sized sorghum crops this year. That's mainly what's moving through the export supply chains at the moment. I think we get to July, if we get some of these trade issues worked out with China, we should see that sorghum basis come back. At the moment, with the cheap basis we've had here, it's pricing itself into the feed grain rice. It's pretty aggressively, not only in the U.S., but we've seen good sorghum exports into Mexico there as well.
Yeah, so outlook for next year with US and China not quite so apparently moving towards reconciliation on trade issues, a lot more positive. And that's basically what the USDA is saying. Hey, we're going to go back to a normal year next year, and that'll make a big difference in Kansas for grain sorghum.
Do you
Yes.
think we'll see changes with the grain sorghum market as we think about planting it?
That's a great question. I think uh, that and right now, and even at the most recent report that's come out, we haven't seen we're just trickling along with grain sorghum exports. We still have a really weak basis. We're still waiting for the promise of what's coming in the future. I don't see a lot of support in the short run for sorghum until we start to see movement and the basis starts to come closer to corn and people have more trust in how that grain sorghum export picture is going to work out.
Yeah, with planting progress moving forward, fairly good and reasonable moisture profiles in a lot of places. I think a lot of growers will tend to plant more corn. Soybeans still above $10, so maybe some of that later planting stays in beans. It's just with that lower basis that we're seeing on sorghum. It's just there's not a big incentive there to plant a lot.
But the promise is to turn this thing around. You know, don't want to be down on that crop. It's a great crop. It has a great place out in our part of the world, but it does seem like that if the exports come back, then sorghum sort of disengages from corn a bit, has its own market, and then you change attitudes and you see acreage stand up all that much more.
Yes.
That was K-State grain economist Dan O'Brien and the senior economist at the IGP Institute at K-State, Guy Allen. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but when we come back, we'll once again be joined by Dan and Guy as we continue our conversation.